One of you commented that I should try the most difficult recipe in the Jefferson archives, the one that was in his personal desk. A dish so complex it shouldn't even exist in the 1700s. Well, I'm taking the bait. Welcome back to A Bite Out of History. July 1784, Thomas Jefferson is standing on the docks of Le Havre, France. He isn't just a diplomat. He is a man on a mission to save a reputation. Because back in America, he's been mocked for his extravagant taste. But here in Paris, he realizes that the young United States is being treated like a child at the adult table. The kings of Europe don't care about our Declaration of Independence. They care about our refinement. Jefferson knew that if America was going to survive, we didn't just need a constitution. We needed to prove we could outdine the French monarchy. But there was a shadow over the Atlantic. That just happened. Next week, I am going to do something that history has spent 3 centuries trying to bury or even just figure out. We are going to break the seal on this jar and bake the madness loaf, making as close as we can get to making the bread from the seeds that turned neighbors into monsters and sent the innocent to the gallows. It is a bread made of shadows, and it has been waiting for a long time to be tasted again. Now, to bring this history to life, we have to follow the pact. Jefferson didn't just bring James Hemings to Paris to cook. He brought and paid a lot too, by the way, which we'll talk more about here in a little bit, to have him as a culinary spy. Jefferson wrote a formal agreement that said James would be granted his freedom, but only after he returned to Virginia and masterfully trained a successor in every single one of these 18 specific grueling steps. This wasn't just a recipe, it was a technical manual. If James couldn't replicate and teach every single scientific variable perfectly, his future remained in Virginia at Monticello. Today, I'm the student, and we're going to see if we can master the 1,800 days of training that once stood between a man and his freedom. Starting with step 1. The cream procurement. This is the very first test of a master chef. In 1784, James would have had to source cream so thick a silver spoon could stand upright in it. And to be honest, we couldn't find anything that stable in a modern grocery store. So we're already starting at a disadvantage, which just means we have to be even more precise with the next 17 steps, just to keep this from turning into a bowl of vanilla soup. Step 2. The scalding. Next, we have to haunt the pot. I'm looking for a shiver, hot enough to steam, but never boil. If we let this hit a rolling boil, the proteins break and the texture is ruined before we even begin. We are looking for molecular stability, not heat. This leads us to step 3. The tempering. French chefs in the 1780s called this the heartbreaker because there is no undo but. If we pour this hot cream too fast, the eggs scramble, the fat separates, and the French style, that silky, smooth velvet that Jefferson was so obsessed with, is dead. For James, the stakes were even higher. He wasn't just cooking for a guest. He was being tested by Monsieur Combu to see if he had mastered the chemistry of the Enlightenment. In a world of manual labor and expensive ingredients, a ruined custard wasn't just a kitchen fail, it was a financial disaster. Since James's freedom depended on completing this training perfectly, every mistake was a literal delay in his future. We aren't just whisking eggs, we are trying to replicate the flawless technical standard that redefined the American palate. Most people know the name Hemings, but they don't know James Hemings was the first American to be professionally trained as a French chef. Under the tutelage of Monsieur Combu, James was mastering step 4, the ribbon. This ribbon wasn't just a visual cue, it was the only way for him to prove he had mastered the French technical manual without a single modern instrument. This was the final exam he had to pass every single day to stay on path. Without this, step 5, the coagulation won't work. James had to understand the exact second the sugar stabilized the proteins to create frozen velvet instead of a block of ice. We are whisking the very same science that James used to command the most sophisticated kitchen in America. Step 6, the clarification. This is the easy part, straining out any tiny imperfections, which leads us to step 7, the infusion. In the 1780s, vanilla was a biological lock. Only the Melipona stingless bee knew how to open. Because this bee was native only to Mexico, the Spanish Empire had a literal global biological monopoly. You could take the vine anywhere in the world. It would grow, it would bloom beautifully, but without that specific bee to navigate the orchid's complex anatomy, it would never produce a single bean. It was a botanical dead end. It stayed that way for centuries until a 12-year-old boy named Edmund Albius discovered the manual key to the lock, a simple blade of grass used to hand pollinate the flower. But in James Hemings' time, that secret didn't exist. If you had vanilla on your table, you were telling your guests, I have the connections to bypass an empire and harness the rarest flavor on earth. But the bean was only half the equation. The other half was the massive investment in technical training James underwent in Paris. This wasn't just a casual apprenticeship. Jefferson was paying 24 livres a month, the equivalent of a master artisan's full salary, specifically for James to study under the premier caterer Monsieur Combu. Over 5 years, that tuition climbed to over 1,000 livres. In today's money, that's an investment of nearly $200,000. James was essentially earning a PhD in chemistry and learning a second language at the same time. Because we have to keep in mind that he didn't know French, so he had to learn it alongside his cooking. By the time he returned to Virginia, he was a chef de cuisine, a high-value specialist carrying a fortune's worth of intellectual property in his head. When Jefferson spent a fortune on vanilla, he was trusting a specialist who had spent 1,800 days mastering the precise science required to make it work. This technical mastery was in high demand. George Washington famously spent $200 on chilled cream in just 3 months. That's about $8,000 in today's money. Now we're about to dive into the high stakes engineering of the ice houses, but I have to tell you, all of this effort leads to a culinary trick so impossible that people in the 1780s thought it was a miracle. Later in the video, we're going to explore how James used physics to serve a steaming hot pastry that's actually frozen velvet on the inside. But first, we have to survive the ice house. Step 8, the subterranean chill. Now you might think an ice house is just a closet for ice, but for James, it was a high-stakes management job. To have ice in a Virginia July, you had to be a master of architecture and thermodynamics. Jefferson's ice house was a 16-foot deep, stone-lined pit, and James was responsible for its health. He had to ensure the drainage was clear, because if even an inch of water pooled at the bottom, it would melt the entire year's supply in days. He managed the insulation of straw and sawdust to keep the heat out. It was essentially a $1,200 a month battery of cold, and James was the one keeping it alive. That brings us to step 9, the ice procurement. For James, this wasn't opening a bag from the gas station. This was the haul. Every piece of ice had to be hand-sawn from the Rivanna River in January, hauled by wagon and packed tight. Every pound I'm using right now represents a massive investment of human labor that James had to oversee 6 months before he ever touched a whisk. Now we get to step 10, the salt charge. In 1784, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was a chemical catalyst. James had to use it to bully the heat out of the cream. This was the high-tech weaponry of the 18th century kitchen, using expensive imported salt to manipulate nature itself, just to impress a table of diplomats. Step 11, the canister lock. Since we're going purely manual, I'm nesting our work bowl directly into the ice salt matrix. There's no lid to hide behind. We have to maintain a perfect seal of ice around the base to ensure every joule of heat is pulled out of that cream. Step 12, the salty bully. Now we introduce this salt. This is the most dangerous part of the manual because we are working with an open bowl. The salt, our bully, is inches away from the cream. If even one single grain of salt falls into this custard, the chemistry is ruined and the batch is lost. We have to pack the bully tight around the base while keeping the rim of our bowl surgically clean. If we use too little salt, the heat heist doesn't happen fast enough and the ice cream becomes grainy. If we use too much, it freezes into a rock before it can aerate. For James, a failure here meant serving warm soup to a table of diplomats looking for a reason to doubt the American. In the 1780s, the physics had to be perfect or the prestige was lost. Step 13, the first agitation. Historians call this frozen labor. In 1784, you didn't have a motor, you had muscle. James Hemings didn't just make ice cream, he fought for it. As the salt charge steals the heat, the cream solidifies against the freezing metal walls. If I stop moving, it will freeze into a jagged, solid block of dairy ice. That's why step 14, the scrape, exists. And step 15, the continuous whip. For 3 hours, I have to continuously stir this and scrape the crystals off of the walls and beat air into the thickening fat. It is a grueling endurance test, but it's the only way we can reach that frozen velvet texture. Step 16, the firming. We stop the agitation and let the bowl sit undisturbed in the brine for 30 minutes. This is where the molecular structure finally locks into a solid, which takes us to step 17, the extraction. This is the moment of truth. James had to carefully wipe away every trace of salt brine from the lid before opening it, because a single drop of salt water falling into the canister would ruin 5 years of perfection in a split second. He would be looking for a clean, dry break. However, since we're working with an open top, then we have to be even more careful as to not let a single drop of salt brine get into the bowl. We have to maintain surgical cleanliness. This leads to step 18. The brioche encasement. This was the ultimate magic trick of the Enlightenment. One famous guest, a British officer named Captain Basil Hall, was completely baffled by it. He wrote that he couldn't understand how he was being served a hot pastry that, once broken open, contained a ball of solid velvet ice cream. He literally didn't have the scientific vocabulary to explain how the hot pastry acted as a thermal insulator for the cold core. To Hall, it was a miracle. To James Hemings, it was just physics he had mastered through the years, and apparently 4 arms of steel. But today, we finally replicated it. Well, here we are. We finally made it. That was brutal. I'm not even gonna put the recipe in the description down below because I don't want to torture you. So now for our first taste. Now I did add strawberries and blueberries into this, but we'll see how it tastes. Here it is. Look at that. Look at that beauty. Look at that beauty. 2 days worth of work. I'm gonna find out if it was all worth it right here. Now, I did put blueberries and strawberries in it. Let's see. Wow. I was really upset. But this tastes, it is velvety. I can taste every single drip of sweat. That's delicious. It is unlike any ice cream I've ever bought in the store. Super velvety. It's very delicious. Anyways, it's good. If you're up for it sometime, give it a shot. I'm not going to be responsible for providing you with the directions. It leaves a lasting taste on your tongue that tastes good. And one of the most important things is you actually know what's in your ice cream. Next week, we are doing the one thing history warns us never to do. I'm going to open this jar and be baking the madness loaf. If you want to see the first bite of the loaf that was considered a trigger for the gallows, you know what to do. We'll see you next time, somewhere in the past. Nick here from A Bite Out of History. I have one last thing I would like to say. Happy 4th of July from one veteran to another. I would like to thank you for your service. We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for your sacrifices. That was grueling. I was really pushing it to get this video out by today. And if you're watching this as soon as the video came out, most likely it's within about 20 minutes of me filming this, because I have not slept and I am really eager to go to bed. I will see you guys next week, somewhere in the past.